A huge thank you to our partners who were listed on the slideshow before tonight's program. I want to give a huge heartfelt thank you to Rick Solomon, Vice President of our Board of Directors, for setting up this meaningful program this evening. Rick, thank you so much. And you may introduce the program.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate it. Good evening. I'm Rick Solomon, Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our Board of Directors, our entire staff and volunteers, I'm honored to welcome each of you to this important program. As an institution grounded in the history and lessons of the Holocaust that works to share universal lessons of humanity and generate awareness and action against injustices worldwide, it is a pleasure to share this special commemorative Juneteenth program with you. For nearly 10 years, we have used special exhibitions, public and educational programming to engage our audiences through stories that connect us as humans. Stories that help us to teach, to learn, and inspire, as well as stories that help us to look inward and grapple with the difficult narratives of the past, including genocide and crimes against humanity. Through our exhibitions and programming, we want to create a forum for dialogue with our visitors that speak to the legacies of such histories, to how we see each other, and the challenges of inequity and injustice which we still face today. Our Law Enforcement Action and Democracy, LEAD, initiative has for years trained Chicago police recruits, Cook County Sheriff and Correctional Department employees, and suburban law enforcement to understand abuses of authority, responding to hate crimes and bias, and balancing the rights of individuals with societal protection. This program could not be more timely, with Sherrilyn fresh off testifying before Congress today. Juneteenth is the oldest known celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, the history of freedom, and the intertwined legacy of systemic racism in this country for some 400 years continue to have lasting effects on generations today. One need only look at what has happened in Minnesota, Georgia, New York, Ferguson, Missouri, Kentucky. Sadly, the list continues. In cities across the country, people should use this time to acknowledge this period in our history that shaped and continues to influence our society today and seek to repair our broken world. I want to thank all of our community partners listed on our opening slides for their continued support. Before we begin, we ask, as Wendy indicated, that you kindly turn off your video. This will allow participants to focus on our speakers and reduce bandwidth issues. Thank you for your cooperation. It is now my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Sherrilyn Ifill, and moderator, Alex Kotlowitz. Sherrilyn Ifill is the President and the Director General of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the nation's premier civil rights law organization fighting for racial justice and equality. LDF was founded in 1940 by legendary civil rights lawyer and later U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and became a separate organization from the NAACP in 1957. The lawyers at the Legal Defense Fund developed and executed the strategy that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, widely regarded as the most transformative and monumental legal decision of the 20th century. Ms. Ifill is the second woman to lead the organization. In 1993, Sherrilyn left LDF to join the faculty at the University of Maryland School of Law in Baltimore. Over 20 years, Ms. Ifill has taught civil procedure and constitutional law to thousands of law students and pioneered a series of law clinics, including one of the earliest law clinics in the country focused on challenging legal barriers to the reentry of ex-offenders into society. Ifill is a prolific scholar who has published academic articles in leading law journals, op-eds, and commentaries in key newspapers. Her 2007 book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, was highly acclaimed and is credited with laying the foundation for contemporary conversations about lynching and reconciliation. A 10th anniversary edition of the book was recently released with a foreword by Brian Stevenson, the acclaimed lawyer and founder of the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. In 2013, Ms. Ifill was invited back to the Legal Defense Fund, this time to lead the organization as its 7th director counsel. In that role, Sherrilyn has increased the visibility and engagement of this organization in cutting edge and urgent civil rights issues while maintaining the organization's decades-long leadership fighting voter suppression, inequity in education, and racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty. The program will be a conversation moderated by Alex Kotlowitz, a world-renowned journalist, filmmaker, and best-selling author. Alex is a senior lecturer and writer in residence at Northwestern University and the author of the national bestseller, There Are No Children Here, selected by the New York Public Library as one of the 150 most important books of the entire 20th century, and adapted into a television movie starring Oprah Winfrey. Alex's latest book is An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, chosen as one of the best books of 2019 by NPR, The Washington Post, as well as The Economist. Alex has received honors in all 3 media, including an Emmy, 2 Peabodys, and the George Polk Award, as well as the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award and the Harold Washington Literary Award. His writing was recently honored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I am pleased to welcome Sherrilyn and Alex. Thank you.
Hi, Sherrilyn.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
Good, good. It's such an honor to be here with you. And I feel like it's an incredible privilege at this moment for us to be able to sit down with you and hear some of your wisdom and guidance, given your years battling for racial equity. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I mean, there's so much to talk about tonight, and I want to spend the first part talking about these past couple of weeks and talking about police accountability, but I want to move beyond that because I think this is a moment in time where we've got to widen this conversation. But I want to begin by asking you, and I feel like, I mean, these past 2 weeks have been absolutely momentous. I mean, I feel like the earth has shifted beneath me, and I feel like it's still shifting beneath me as we speak. And what I'm trying to make sense of is why this video, why this one incident has sparked this movement, this protest. I mean, we've seen in the past, sadly, other incidents of police abuse of Black men, killing of Black men, and yet this particular video somehow catapulted people into the streets, and catapulted them into the streets at a time when everybody, in fact, needed to be home. So what sparked, what was different about this moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've, been kind of playing around with this in my mind as well, because my reaction to this was actually different as well. And this is what I do. So I had a very, very deep, enraged, outraged, and really devastated reaction to this video. So there was something different. I think it's important to remember how this all unfolded. It's in the context of us being in the midst of this global pandemic, of over 100,000 people having died from this pandemic, a disproportionate number of them from the communities of people I represent. We have seen a response to the COVID pandemic, at least for the communities of people I represent, that has been inadequate and deeply concerning. There are people suffering. There are families upon families upon families grief-stricken without the means to do what we normally do to express our grief in terms of being able to be with our loved ones at the end and have homegoing services and the things that we kind of hold on to. So I think there's been a heavy weight on us across the country. So I think we should remember that that's kind of the context in which this happened, and that that's not irrelevant, that there is a heaviness in the country at this moment. I think the president, to be frank, obviously is a contributor to that. We're under a lot of strain, actually, listening to a certain kind of rhetoric, a certain kind of coarseness. And I'm going to be perfectly frank with you. I lead a nonpartisan organization. I'm not affiliated with any political party, but I am a civil rights lawyer, and this president is oppositional to all of the principles of civil rights that I stand for, and frankly, to the rule of law, which I've committed my life to. And so some of the strain of just the rhetoric that we hear, I think, we think that we're kind of used to it, but likely we're not. And then this video, it comes 2 weeks after we saw Ahmaud Arbery chased by 3 men in 2 pickup trucks in Georgia and killed. And then this video comes. So I think when you set that context around it, you can understand why we were kind of teed up emotionally. And when I say we, I really mean the country emotionally, people in the country who want justice, who believe in truth, who believe in equality, who are grieving. And then this particular video is actually terrible. They're all terrible, but there is something particularly excruciating that I found in this video as well. And as I've said, I was interviewed on 60 Minutes on Sunday night. And as I said then, for me, it was the casualness of the killer, the principal killer, Derek Chauvin, with his hands in his pockets, looking out at us, having no fear of the fact that he's being videotaped, hearing the voices of all the people around him saying, stop, he can't breathe. It really looked like, I compare it to the image of Emmett Till in the casket. I think there are moments when we just see the darkest part of the American soul, and it moves us. It moves us, in the African-American community. First of all, 10,000 people went to the viewing of Emmett Till in Chicago. Many more saw the photograph in Jet magazine, which was, in nearly every African-American home in those days. And so sometimes there is a picture. It's interrupting judgment at Nuremberg on a Sunday night to see the images on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Right. There are these images sometimes that I think show us something so awful that actually galvanizes the country in a very particular way in the protection of its soul. Right. And that's what this felt like and feels like to me.
Right. And I think one of the things for me that's encouraging and is that actually not only galvanized Blacks, but it's also galvanized whites in this country. I saw that you tweeted this today, but NASCAR today announces that they will no longer allow the Confederate flag at their racetracks. We're just 2 weeks out from this incident.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I said I think it's like a moment when America sees itself, and I think that's the same of Selma, of interrupting judgment at Nuremberg on a Sunday night, right? And people seeing Selma, or the photograph of Emmett Till. I think there are moments when this country can see its worst part, and it moves people in a very particular way. And I think that's what's happened. And the other piece is, you said why this particular one? There is a cumulative effect. The through line between 2014 and Eric Garner, watching him be choked to death and saying, I can't breathe, and Ahmaud Arbery saying, I can't breathe. I think that sense of impotence, that it's 5 years later and here it is again, I think is pretty, 6 years later, is also part of the reason. There is the kind of cumulative frustration, the kind of feeling of enough is enough. And even people like me who've been working in this field, and see some measures of progress in the field, it just felt like enough is enough.
Right. And you mentioned the sort of coarseness of the rhetoric coming from our president, which I think is really important to acknowledge. And your wonderful book on the Courthouse Lawn, in that you have a chapter that's actually titled "Breaking the Silence: Words are the Most Powerful Tools of All." And I think you meant it in an affirmative way there, but you can see how the destructive nature it can have as well. I mean, I think I go back to, his mentioning of the white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia, as being, there were fine people on both sides. His talking of the NFL players who took a knee as sons of bitches, his tweeting when the looting starts, the shooting starts. I could go on and on. Can you talk a little bit about the cumulative effect of that rhetoric?
Yeah, I really believe that, this is part of the book, that I believe that. So I wrote the book about lynching, but as you know, I talk about the Holocaust, I talk about the genocide in Rwanda, and many other incidents of mass violence. And I was really trying to get into the kind of question of, like, how do people get here? How do people get to that place? How do ordinary people end up doing these terrible and extraordinary things, or being complicit, or watching, or participating? And it really came because, as I was learning about the lynchings I was writing about, and about lynching more generally, I don't recall being actually very interested in exploring the motivations of the people who actually, hung the rope or lit the match. I actually was really interested in the crowd. I was actually interested in the people who kind of watched and how they got there, and I think one of the things I try to talk about is the way in which the narrative is like a really important piece in getting us there, like how we begin to talk about other people, and how we begin to talk about the humanity of other people, or how we, by our language, deny the humanity of other people, does a lot of the work to getting us there, right? And we saw it in Rwanda, we saw it in Nazi Germany. We absolutely have seen it in the particular period in the American South that I was writing about, but throughout the history of this country, in terms of the narrative about who Black people are, and particularly who Black men are. And that this allows you, once you have done this dehumanization work with words, it really gets you somewhere. And I think we have to be so conscious of that, of the ways in which the language, and that's why some of the language that the president and his supporters have used about hordes coming over the border. I worry a lot about the language of insects. I worry about those things. When I watched the NYPD the other night, the way they were spraying the crowds, almost like they were doing some kind of, like these were bugs, not like these were human beings. There was just kind of, we walk through and we spray. I think we have to be very, 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 very careful and nervous about the slide that happens when we allow a certain kind of language and a certain kind of crudeness to govern how we engage with one another. Because actually, I believe in honesty and forthrightness for sure. But I actually think that, like, the decency of how we talk with each other is actually a real thing. It's like something to be protected, even people with whom I'm opposed. And so I think that some of Mr. Trump's rhetoric, the idea that he has removed the velvet rope from speaking in a certain way, and you can see the headiness of it, how people are kind of taken with the idea of, wow, you mean I didn't have to worry about how people react to what I say? I don't have to worry about hurting people's feelings. I don't have to worry about saying things that might be seen as anti-Semitic or racist. There's almost a heady sense of freedom, and it's dangerous. And I think, those of us, most of us in this country have grown up in a different world in which whatever else was going on, people tried to say things that didn't sound that way. And I think we underestimate sometimes how much pressure we've been under to just hear that talk, to receive that kind of talk. It's very troubling, very difficult.
No, I think you're right. And I think it is a kind of slippery slope where you begin to sort of accept and in some cases adapt that rhetoric. And the other thing for me that I have trouble wrapping my head around is why those in his orbit are unwilling or unable to call him out on. I mean, they can agree with them on policy, but why can't they call them out on the language, on the ugliness of the rhetoric? I mean, you must feel that as well.
It is one of the most mystifying, but also, frankly, depressing aspects of this moment. Is how many people are unwilling to do that. And I think, I was saying the other day to my husband that we're all still in middle school. The fear of the bully is a hell of a thing. The fear that someone will make fun of you, the fear that someone will tweet something about you tomorrow. I mean, it really reveals just like the deep core of insecurity in many of the grown-up people in enormous positions of responsibility around him. But it's also true that some people are just calculating, and the most important thing to them is power. And I think that's what scares me, if anything does, about the moment that we're in, is that we're seeing a kind of a naked embrace of raw power. So that, the rules don't matter, ethics don't matter, comedy doesn't matter, the choreography of how things are normally done in the Senate or in the House doesn't matter, right? All of that is being swept away in the raw pursuit of power.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, maybe I'm being a little Pollyannish here, but I wonder if we're at some inflection point where we're beginning to question that. And again, I go back to NASCAR, I go back to the NFL's announcement that they now will allow for protests. There seems to be a conversation taking place that I've never seen before. And do you feel that at all? Am I being too?
I do. I do, except I think the natural wall of resistance will always be there. And so you can't tell whether your moment is a moment until you get past it, because there is a force that inevitably is pushing back against this being a turning moment, right? And that could make this a moment where people just kind of get, whew, we got out of that one, and I think that that's part of why it's important that we sustain the outrage, that we have a right to be outraged in a sustained way. And I think that we've all tried to be very careful over the last 3 years, and we have a right to be outraged. And I would also say that particularly around this particular issue that has been the issue that's really set things off, which is police brutality in African-American communities and police violence against unarmed African-Americans, this is really unfinished business, right? From the 1960s, from the unrest in 64 and 65 and 67, all the unrest in the northern cities, all sparked by these encounters between police and African-Americans. The Kerner Commission report, is supposed to be focusing on this very issue. And it's the one thing that wasn't addressed. So in a way, it is actually appropriate for us to sit for a minute with this. Some people are saying, well, it's so outrageous. Eric Garner was killed in 2014 and it's been 5 years, but it's been much longer than that. For me, it was, in 1973 when an NYPD officer killed a 10-year-old boy, Clifford Glover, in Queens, where I grew up. That's how, it's a long time. So I think people shouldn't be surprised that there's a sustained sense of outrage, and but I, like you, tend to be optimistic, and I do think this is an inflection moment. Listen, every one of these moments is a move on the road to progress. The idea is to sustain it for as long as you can and get as much as you can out of it, and then it does spring back to something else. But it does bring progress because of the conversations we're having, because of the NASCAR moments, and that there is a kind of a reckoning around things that have been kicked down the road. I have found the conduct of the NFL with regard to Colin Kaepernick absolutely shameful. And I still think that Roger Goodell needs to speak directly to him. This is a young man who attempted a peaceful protest. He's not a perfect young man, but bright, committed, focused, talented, and his career was destroyed. So I just think, there's more to be done, but it's already a step. And so there are things that are happening. There's a reckoning that's happening in this moment, and reckonings can also, sometimes get out of control. But I do think that there's something happening here that is leading us in a direction of truth. And this is an issue that this country really struggles with, is just truth.
Yeah, well, I hope the hope is bears out. I want to talk a little bit about one of the things, obviously, that's come up in this moment too, is the question and issue of police accountability. And for me, there are two parts of this conversation I want to ask you about. One is, Attorney General Bill Barr has recently said that there was no systemic racism in our police departments, and that it's just a matter of bad apples. I know you differ with him on this. Can you address that? And because this is what you hear a lot, as well as just a bad apple here or there.
Well, the Attorney General Barr certainly should know better, because he has available to him the investigative reports from pattern and practice investigations done by the Department of Justice during the Obama years, about 25 in all, resulting in consent decrees in about a dozen cases in which the department investigated patterns and practices of discrimination in police departments and found systemic discrimination. He only needs to read the Baltimore report, which is where I'm speaking to you from, to understand the deeply embedded systems that produce the department that could kill Freddie Gray, and that could produce the department that also produced this gun trace task force unit, which was prosecuted over the last few years in a case first brought by Rod Rosenstein, the former U.S. attorney and deputy attorney general. So he could read that report. He could read the Ferguson report, and how a whole town basically supported itself through the fines and fees attached to minor infractions and imposed on poor Black people in that community. He could read any of those reports. He could read Newark and Camden and Seattle and New Orleans, and he would discover, and for heaven's sakes, in Chicago, he would discover that there is systemic discrimination. So that's just simply Barr refusing to even do the work. And it's shameful. It's a complete abdication of his responsibility. I hear the bad apples theory all the time, and I really wish I had it up here. When I was testifying today, I had the sheet available with all the lists of all of the settlement payouts for misconduct and police brutality paid out by various cities over the last few years. Millions, tens of millions of dollars, tens of millions. In the case of Chicago and New York, over $100 million, $200 million in a 5-year period paid out in misconduct and police brutality settlements. So these bad apples are running up quite a tab in police departments around the country. And by the way, police departments, large and small, not just in big cities. And these individuals operate in systems. I mean, so 4 bad apples happen to get out of a car, get out of several cars and approach George Floyd. Somehow we got 4 apples together. No, it is a system in which officers operate. And one of the key elements of that system is the word that you said, is about lack of accountability. And the knowledge that they will not be held accountable for conduct that is unconstitutional against African Americans has allowed a culture to develop in which police officers feel they have impunity when they engage in these actions. And that's around the country. And that includes officers who are African American, as we found in Baltimore. So it's a system. And if the Attorney General is so unsophisticated that he can't see that, then the fact that he is leading the nation's law enforcement agency is quite alarming. And if that's not it, if he's just so arrogant that he can't admit what he doesn't know, he's not a civil rights lawyer. He's not African American. He has no portfolio or record of having actually studied anything to do with racism. So really quite astonishing for him to then, as the country is erupting, to sit on 60 Minutes and simply say there is no systemic racism.
Yeah, and I'll point out that the city of Chicago has paid out $700 million over the past 10 years.
Here it is. It's extraordinary. And I'm sorry, I said 60 Minutes. I meant he was on Face the Nation, I believe, last week.
So one of the conversations that people are having now is this notion of defunding the police, which I think is a little it's a little misleading, I think, what people are suggesting. I don't think people are suggesting abolition, though there are people out there who do suggest that.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about where you stand on this notion of sort of taking resources from the police and placing them elsewhere?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of funding issues we have to talk about. And I think you actually already described it perfectly, right? There are some people who are talking about abolition, but there's some people who are talking about defunding, and by that really drastically reducing police budgets, which tend to be the largest budget in our municipal systems. And it really starts from the premise and the idea that police officers are not the only public safety actors in a community ecosystem, right? And so I've been moving away from talking about policing reform and talking about public safety, because that's what this is really about. And people in my community want public safety also. They also want to be safe. But police officers are not the only public safety actors in a community. There are many other individuals and groups in communities that provide the kinds of services that keep the community safe, or that help keep the community safe. And I think the question on the table is, it's not even a question. I think the fact on the table is that we have assigned to police officers and to the criminal justice system public safety functions that need not rest with them, and the results are sometimes catastrophic. So I heard people at the hearing I was testifying at today saying, "Oh, but what happens when there's some violent incident happening? You'll want to call the police." Of course, and you should have the police for circumstances in which you absolutely need that. But the truth is, if there is a naked man having a mental breakdown in the street, I'm not sure that you need an armed police officer. And maybe if you had another number to call instead of 911, if you had the 711 mental health number, maybe Anthony Hill would not have been killed in Atlanta a few years ago. Maybe Deborah Danner, the grandmother in Brooklyn, or Eleanor Bumpers, in the Bronx, so Eleanor Bumpers, the grandmother in Brooklyn in New York, would not have been killed by the police. Because if your grandmother is experiencing dementia or having some kind of issue, really, do you want to call 911? You don't. You may do it, but that's because you have no other option. If there are young people who are outside making noise and it's midnight and they're sitting on your car and you tell them, cut it out, and then they yell back up at you and cuss at you, do you really want to call 911? If there were a 511 number that would dispatch people who are youth counselors and conflict resolvers who would come on the scene and engage with them, maybe you would want to do that. Do we really think that we needed 4 armed officers to address a man who's alleged to have written a $20 bad check, as George Floyd was? So the idea is to shrink the footprint of the police in our communities, because this continuous engagement around issues that don't require actually an armed officer to diffuse that conflict or to deal with that issue actually leaves open this possibility for these killings that I've just described. We know that officers don't have to do anything, because when you and I were young, there was no such number as 311, right? We came up with 311 because if your cat's in a tree, they don't want you to call 911 because that's for real emergencies. And I'm not suggesting these other things aren't real emergencies. They are real emergencies, but they require people of particular skill. They don't require a taser and a gun. Now, it may be that the situation, once they get there, escalates and they need to then call 911. But the idea that that's the only tool that we have available, that we invite into our community, armed officers to deal with $20 bad checks and youth conflicts, and a homeless person walking in the street instead of on the sidewalk, which was the facts of the case that I referred to in my testimony today, in which this homeless man was killed by these 5 police officers and shot 22 times while he laid motionless on the ground. They approached him because he was walking in the street and not on the sidewalk. Or our client, Carrie Illich, who was tased to death 19 times for trespassing. So that's the question. Do we need the way we think of police as public safety officers, or is there a different and broader public safety corps, CORPS, so that if your child were having some kind of mental health breakdown and you feared that they might harm themselves, you could call that number and those people would be dispatched to your home, instead of officers who come armed, who might actually exacerbate the situation and result in your child being killed. So when we talk about that, we're talking about, first of all, shrinking the footprint, and then we're talking about those resources that we would use being used to support these other services within the community, being used to support youth services and conflict resolution and homelessness services and mental health services and so forth. And so that's what the defunding looks like. It is, we are speaking values through our budget. And to the extent we're spending the kind of money we're spending for the police officers that we've all seen the past week with all the toys and bells and whistles and military equipment, and yet we all saw 2 months ago when nurses in Mount Sinai Hospital were wearing garbage bags because they didn't have PPE, when all of us know that every year teachers purchase items for their classrooms with their own money and send home lists to parents of supplies that have to be provided to the classroom, we're making judgments through our budget about what we value. And so the defund concept, or the radically reduced police budget concept, is about reimagining public safety to imagine that these other actors are also part of the public safety apparatus, and to create public safety corps, CORPS, right, of which the police are a part, but they are not the sole actors within that ecosystem. And then just finally, if people really are concerned about the funding issue, then they should be worried about the $700 million in Chicago spent to settle misconduct settlements, and the millions and millions spent in cities around this country every year as just part of the cost of doing business to pay out for claims of police officers who brutalize innocent citizens.
No, I like this sort of holistic notion you have. And I think the other part of it is, to be honest, it would ease the burden and stress of police. That they would...
Well, police say they don't want to be social workers, right? They say, you know, we're asked to do everything and we can't do everything and we're misunderstood. And I agree with them that they can't do everything. But we need to shift resources so that others who are trained to do that kind of work will have the resources they need to be effective in the community.
Let me ask, I want to just switch, if we could just pivot for a moment. You know, when you were on 60 Minutes the other night, you talked about the fragility of our democracy. And I think one of the places where we see that at the moment is in voting rights. And of course, we had the debacle in Georgia yesterday, where we had lines of people unable to get into polling booths that weren't operating, people who had not gotten absentee ballots. We saw it in Wisconsin earlier when they prohibited the use of mail-in ballots. And I know this is of a deep concern to you and LDF. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that regard, especially with the national election coming up in November?
Yeah, fragility of democracy. You know, I've always said that you can't actually even begin to count American democracy until at least 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. Because if you actually had a large swath of the country that was a legal apartheid state, that's not really a democracy, right? So that's at least 1954. But there's a good argument for 1965, because even after 1964, most Black people in the South, and most Black people live in the South, really could not freely participate in the political process and vote. So if we start counting from 1965, we're talking about a very young democracy, a very young democracy. And in 2013, in June 2013, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision by Chief Justice Roberts, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, decided that this democracy was more mature than it is, decided that we have arrived, decided that we no longer needed a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, that if it had still been in place, which was put in place in 1965 and struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013, what happened in Georgia yesterday could not have happened. Because every one of the changes, from the new machines to polling places to new training and so forth, would have had to have been pre-cleared by a federal authority, either the Department of Justice or by a judge in the DC District Court. But Chief Justice Roberts and a majority of the court, a 5-member majority of the court, decided that we have arrived, that we no longer needed this, that this was a brand on the South, that we were punishing the South for behavior that was decades old, and it was no longer necessary. And they countermanded a voluminous record that had been developed by Congress, and decided that this is what they felt on their own. And since 2013, we have been seeing, and we did almost immediately, the consequences of that. To the extent that voter suppression is a new idea to people, for those of us who, I started my career as a voting rights litigator in the South, we've been working with this for a very long time. But you're noticing it because in 2013, it started to get out of control because we no longer had this tool, pre-clearance. And now northern jurisdictions saw that you could actually play these games with voting, and it now, practices that had been limited to the South have now metastasized to the North. And so we see them all over the place, and we see voter ID, and we see the polling place changes and all that kind of stuff. Now we see that in Kansas and Wisconsin and North Dakota and places that had not even been part of the original set of jurisdictions that were covered by Section 5 until 2013. So yes, we're deeply concerned. We're in litigation right now in 3 states. Actually, we had a good win in South Carolina before their primary, because we were very concerned about voting and COVID and African-American communities who disproportionately suffer from COVID infection and COVID death. And so we have been working to try to extend and relax the hard restrictions on absentee voting in a number of these states and expand absentee voting to the extent we can, so that people have the option of not having to show up at the polls. In Alabama, you have to have 2 witnesses sign your absentee ballot, and you have to send a photocopy of your government-issued photo ID. We also happen to be challenging Alabama's photo ID law. Louisiana also has a witness requirement and so forth. And in South Carolina, the judge agreed with us that the witness requirement was unconstitutional at this moment because of the effect it would have on those who feared COVID infection. And this is going to take us into November, that these cases will have to be revived. We have no idea whether we will have another COVID spike in the fall. So try to imagine that happening. Some places are just experiencing their COVID spike now. So there's a lot we don't know, and we are doing our level best to try to make sure that we relieve what are some of the barriers. I will say every time we have one of these elections, like Wisconsin, it's both depressing and exhilarating. It's depressing because here we are supposed to be a real democracy and people are waiting 4 and 5 hours to vote, and exhilarating because here are people waiting 4 and 5 hours to vote. People want to participate in the political process. They are bound and determined, and there really is a certain kind of beauty in that. I don't think people should have to do it, and so we're fighting it. I don't think people should have to risk their lives because of COVID, and so we're fighting it. But seeing that determination to vote actually makes us fight all the harder.
Right. We're running out of time. I have so much more I want to talk to you about your work on health disparities and economic disparity, but I want to end on this sort of question. It's kind of the natural question of where do we go from here? But I want to really sort of ask where do we go from here? I want to ask that of white America. Where do we go from here? And I think back on, a number of years ago, Nicole Hannah-Jones did this really wonderful piece about a decision about where to send her daughter to school. And the issue was, of course, is that the schools in Brooklyn were still deeply segregated. And she writes at the end of the story, we have not had the courage. She writes at the end, true integration, true equality requires a surrendering of advantage. And so where do we as white Americans fit into this at the moment? For me, one of the encouraging things at the moment, of course, is you see the marches, the diversity, the youth, but we've got to somehow sustain that. So let me ask you that question.
Well, let me just, first of all, it's a good opportunity for me to say, Alex, what a great admirer I am of your work and your effort to really try to go in and get the story, of the fissures in our society, and trying to really understand how we live in them, how they get created and how we live in them, and bringing out the kind of human voice. And so I honestly want to turn this question back on you, because I do think that it's an excellent question. Obviously the first step is recognizing that you are advantaged and being able to cope with that. I think we're so invested in our stories, our stories of who we are and how we got to be where we are. And I really want to encourage Americans to kind of, especially white Americans, to unravel some of those stories. For me, I will tell you that one of the things about writing the book about lynching and a lot of the work I've done around housing discrimination. And, I strongly recommend that all of you read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. I always say that to look out on the American landscape, wherever you live, there are so many layers and stories that explain how the place that you're standing on came to be what it is. And weaved into that story is almost always something about racial oppression or discrimination that could be told, right? Black people don't just live on the South Side. Something happened that made that happen, that made that the only place people could live, right? We didn't all just end up where we are. And so I think, so I want to turn it back on you, how willing are white people to engage in that? I don't mean to throw yourself down a rabbit hole of 23andMe. I don't mean like you're getting into your genealogy story. Those are beautiful also. I mean like you have a responsibility for the landscape, understanding that what you see around you was constructed out of policies and decisions and investments.
Right.
And therefore, to the extent that you are advantaged in that space, it means that you are the beneficiary of policies and strategies and investments. The good news is because it was constructed, it can be deconstructed, and you can make different policy decisions and different investments. So there's hope in it. But I'm not sure how much people are willing to do the first part. And I'm not sure I fully understand why the first part feels so personally threatening.
Right. Yeah. Well, I wish I had an easy answer. I mean, I do think one of the great paradoxes of this country is we like to somehow think we're all in it together, and yet we lead so disparate lives, much of it having to do with race. And as you suggest, that it's not by accident. And so there's needs to, it requires some kind of affirmative action to move out beyond your own familiar community. I mean, for Black people, they do it all the time. They have to do it. And for whites, it's so easy to sort of spend time amongst your own, to go to school with people who look like you, to go to church with people who look like you, and so I feel like there's got to be that affirmative quality. I will say again, we're just, we've had 2 weeks of protests, but there has been something really sort of exhilarating about the diversity of marches.
Yes.
And not only the diversity of the marches, but also the diversity of places where these marches have occurred.
Yes, in all 50 states, and in small towns. And you're absolutely right. This kind of racially diverse coming together has been, it really tells me something. And I say it all the time, which is why I love doing, events. I continue to do events no matter what, because I feel terrible that we're in this COVID moment, but I always say we have to come out and see each other, because I think so many of us kind of, we read our books and we watch MSNBC all night or whatever it is we do, and we get kind of isolated. And I've always believed there are more of us than there are of them. And by us, I mean people who care about equality and justice and the dignity of all people and full citizenship. I really believe that. And so one of the things that's been extraordinary to see is to just see that, is to really see that there just are more of us. There just are. We for a lot of reasons, we're not able to turn that into power in many instances. And I think that's because the values that we embrace are values that necessarily make what we do kind of messy. So we value dissent, right? We value, hearing people out. We value people being able to make their own decision. We're not lockstep people, so it makes it harder for us. But we are people of value, and I have been incredibly encouraged, and I hope it sustains itself through this period.
Sherrilyn, thanks so much. This has been such an honor to spend time with you. I know there are people who have questions, and I know you agreed to 10 or 15 minutes.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Please.
So.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. And Sherrilyn, your words, your inspiration are so important for the world right now, and we appreciate you being here. We have so many questions that have come in. Everyone wants to hear from you, Sherrilyn. So what I'm going to do is kind of lump things together, do the best I can, and we'll answer a few questions. Sure. So the first question is, do you think that this is truly a defining moment that will stick, or do you worry that this moment will pass and be lost by our collective attention, diverted by COVID and the economic destruction we need to rebuild from?
No, I actually do believe that this will last. 1965 was a moment too, and after the Voting Rights Act was passed, people said, well, it was just, it's over, right? So, I mean, the fact that the high of it will pass doesn't mean that it's over. It doesn't mean that it didn't have power and value and wasn't transformative, right? So, I mean, you can't sustain forever a sense of, a kind of sense of activism. People get exhausted. But no, I honestly believe this is a moment. There is something very powerful happening. And it is powerful because we've had our eyes awakened to not only the fragility of our democracy, but to the willingness of people to actually allow it to unravel. I think that's the thing many of us didn't know. We believed that if people saw our democracy unraveling, even if we were ideologically opposed to them, we would all hold together, you know, kind of like World War II, or like going under the desk, you know, during the nuclear test, because maybe the Russians are gonna, you know, the Soviet Union is the threat, or, or 9/11, or like the moments where like we kind of linked arms and had a sense of, you know, there is a oneness to us. I think people assumed that would happen, and we now know that it won't. We actually faced a global pandemic and we couldn't come together. So honestly, I think that the scales having fallen from our eyes, we can't unsee what we have seen. And therefore, I do believe that this is a transformative moment.
Well, to piggyback on that, I have another question that is interesting. We sometimes think historical movements with clear leaders like Dr. King, but Black Lives Matter and this particular movement seems to have proven that with a decentralized yet organized effort led by thought leaders like you and protest leaders on the front lines, real change can be achieved. Is this a misconception about the importance of singular figures within momentous movements?
Well, I think that if you study the civil rights movement, what you learn is that it also was a movement that had many leaders. And, you know, who said the other day, Dr. King was carried by the movement. And if you read the wonderful memoir of John Lewis, he talks about the day of the March on Washington and how it was so crowded. And, you know, he was one of the speakers. He was the youngest speaker. And he said they were in the crowd trying to get to the front, trying to get to the days. And he said, it was such a beautiful line. I probably have the book here somewhere. There it is. He said, we were carried by the crowd, or carried by the movement, right? So he's walking, trying to get to the front. But at the end of the day, he said, I couldn't even walk because it was so crowded, and I didn't know how to get there. But there were so many people around me that we were just carried by them. I won't find it now. But I love that, because that is the honest truth. They were carried by a movement, right? Dr. King was 26, and when it was the Montgomery residents, Black residents, who said, you know, you're the one, we want you to lead us, right? And it was Fred Gray who called Thurgood Marshall and said, you know, look, I don't know how to do civil rights law. Can you help me with this case, right? So I think that, you know, that America loves a good story about one hero, but in fact, the civil rights movement was comprised of many people as well. I talk about this in the context of, you know, Thurgood Marshall, our founder, and our work around Brown versus Board of Education, and, you know, the importance of the student walkouts. You know, Barbara Johns deciding to lead a student walkout of her high school in Prince Edward County, Virginia, that really forced the Virginia case that was part of the Brown cases. There were all these other dynamics that I think, you know, when the story gets told and it gets, you know, put in the history books and the television movies get made, it's much easier to make the story a little bit simpler. And Dr. King himself, to his credit, you know, was such a listener. You know, he listened to all those voices. He was very much informed by the people around him. No question, he was an extraordinary, exemplary, almost astonishing leader, really, when you begin to study the work of the man. But it's true that there were many leaders. And so I like the idea that it is organic. I'll just say the last thing, you know, when the civil rights, what's known as the civil rights movement really started, remember Brown versus Board of Education decided in 1954, and LDF, you know, so now we're doing all of these desegregation cases. Southern jurisdictions are resisting tooth and nail, and we've got hundreds of desegregation cases happening around the South. And now suddenly there's a Montgomery bus boycott, there are freedom rides, you know, Martin Luther King's in jail in Americus, Georgia, and Constance Baker Motley has to go get him out, and all of this stuff is happening. This movement is happening entirely separate than this other litigation piece, and the two end up coming together, right? They come together because the movement needs lawyers, and, you know, and LDF's the lawyers, and so we kind of get involved. But like there are always these different pieces that are happening at the same time. And so we're seeing that now, and that's the strength of the movement. We should not be looking for one leader, because if there's one thing that the assassination of Dr. King has shown us is how terrible it can be to coalesce our whole idea of liberation around one person who can be taken away from us, or who can be fallible, or whatever other reasons why. We shouldn't, decide that it's just one person, and the pressure's too much for one person. What Dr. King, I think, just went through as a leader is just so extraordinary. So I think the idea of a decentralized movement, of organic community-based movements, of national civil rights organizations, of colleagues and allies linking arms, it has to be a dynamic organism in order to really have sustaining power.
Thank you, Sherrilyn. I'm going to conclude with this question, which I love. And I just, you're so inspirational. And I think it ties into a little bit of what the museum does. The museum's tagline is "Take history to heart, take a stand for humanity." And several people in the chat have asked, with that in mind, what gives you inspiration to keep on going and not get down and not get frustrated and keep going?
I mean, I said it the other night on 60 Minutes, you just keep going. You have to. Look, every one of us are only here because generations before us kept going. I mean, I don't know how many descendants of dukes and earls and duchesses are in this audience, but most of us, if we go back far enough, our beginnings are fairly humble. People who lived through extraordinary hardship and difficulty and overcame that hardship and difficulty and saw things that were unimaginable and kept going. I think this all the time. I think, people always think that it's the end of the world, but it's not the end of the world. If you were in the belly of that slave ship, you couldn't have thought there was a future. You didn't know where you were going. You were in absolute agony. This had to have seemed, you were kidnapped from everything that you knew, the disorientation of it. It must have seemed like the end of the world, right? For Holocaust survivors, that experience that you went through, it had to have been the end. The world was actually at war. It had to have seemed like this must be the end. People could not be this awful, this inhumane, and humanity go on. And yet somehow we do go on. And people fought and they found each other and made families and found ways to keep going. And the life that I've lived just in the generation, I'm the youngest of 10 children. And just in the transformation in the generation of my own family, thinking about my parents and their parents, my life is unimaginable for my grandparents. So that must mean that my grandkids' life is unimaginable for me. And I think we have to really believe that. I think we get selfish because we want it to be in our lifetimes. And I do too. And, we all want that. We want to see it. We want to, if I can get biblical, we want it, how many times did Moses ask God, please let me go into the promised land, right? And God said, no, you're not going, right? It's going to be Joshua. It's not going to be you. I picked somebody else. Please, let me go. We all want to go. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that someone won't get there or get closer than we got. And it's just our desire to be there and to see it, which is understandable. But we have to really hold on and understand that this is a relay race and we pass that baton and the next set run their race and they get closer.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for your words. And thank you for this evening. And thank you, Alex, for joining us. And Rick, thank you again for your leadership and bringing Sherrilyn to the museum to share this experience. Please take a moment and fill out the survey that's being placed in the chat. It'll help ensure that we are on the mark and let us report back to funders that we may continue doing this incredible programming. We'll hope you join us for other incredible programs coming up. I'm just going to mention a couple. My colleagues will also put the link to our programs in the chat. Coming up this Friday at noon, we have noon Central Standard Time, because I know there's a lot of people from around the globe who are with us. So noon Central Standard Time, Winston Churchill and the Jews, Zionism, Holocaust, and the lessons of the 20th century. So join us for an incredible conversation, take a break at lunch and be with us. And another really important program happening on Tuesday, June 16th, 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's a book and author, The Choice, Embrace the Possible, a conversation with Dr. Edith Egger. She's an incredible woman, New York Times bestseller, was written up on Bill Gates' What to Read list this summer. So Bill Gates says to read it, it's a winner. So please join us. This concludes our formal program. If you want to hang on for just one more question in what I like to call our virtual lobby to hang out a little bit more, you're welcome to. We may take one or maybe two more questions, but that's it. We want to respect your time. You had a crazy busy day. Thank you for being with us. And those of you who want to drop off, we will see you again soon. So Sherrilyn, we have another question that came in that speaks to your busy day that I think is just an interesting thing to ask while we're hanging out in the lobby after the program, is what was it like to be in Congress today? How was your day today, and what did it feel like to be there today?
Well, I joined virtually, so I was not physically there. But I will say, just if you watch any part of the hearing today, the opening statement I thought of George Floyd's brother was really, really, really extraordinary and moving and powerful and important. And it just really important for us to just pause and just really listen to what he was saying about the humanity of his brother. And so that was important and powerful. And that to me was the highlight of the day. That was very early in the day, and when it went on. But it was, it was a long day. It was from 10 to 4:15. So people were hard at work, and the bill, the Justice in Policing Act, is really a pretty comprehensive bill. It was apparent that some members had not read the bill, who had some objections to things that weren't even in it. But it really represents a really serious effort to begin to get at what we know are some of the problems in our legal system and the law that contribute to the lack of accountability of police officers who engage in this conduct.
Thank you, Sherrilyn. I want to be respectful to your time. We all do. It's 8:05. You've had a long day. Okay.
It's 9:05 here.
Yes, it's an hour later where you are. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And we're going to be sending out a thank you letter too with the survey in it. And everyone be well. Good night. We will see you again soon, and hopefully even in person.
Good night, and thank you so much. I so enjoyed this conversation. Good night, Alex.
Good night, everyone.